Good morning to all of my snowbird friends in the warmer regions. Well, it's pretty nice here. It got up to 62 yesterday, so let me entice you to come back home. It is beautiful. We're having the fastest snowmelt I have ever seen in my life. So we would really welcome you home, but right now I'm welcoming you into our study of 1 Peter chapter 2, and where we are right now is kind of a follow-up to last week where we talked about our identity as Christians. Peter has been really intent on making sure that these people who are being maligned by unbelievers in their realm of influence, they're struggling with their lifestyle, with persecution. It's tough to be a Christian in an area where you are not surrounded by your own kind. But if you're in a family with unbelievers, or if your neighbors or the people that you do life with are unbelievers, there are going to be tough things. We're going to talk about things like being maligned verbally, speaking things that are spoken evil against you. And so Peter thinks it's really important that we understand who we are as a believer in order to live that out. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and start in 1 Peter 2 and review a little bit with verses 9 and 10 of who we are. Peter says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." So there again, we're seeing that we are chosen. He doesn't say it in that one, but remember many other times, and in the very next verse, verse 11, we're going to see that we're exiles, which we just already mentioned, that we are living often in settings where we're not well received. We don't belong. As believers, we have a home that is in the future and in heaven. So sometimes we feel out of place here. And so Peter recognizes that. That's part of our identity, of being chosen, being part of a royal priesthood, part of the idea of being holy, part of the idea of being owned by God, and that we have received mercy. So these are important things, this identity. And what he's going to tell us in 11 and 12, which is the bulk of our lesson today, is in light of this identity, we should live like we are who we say we are. Okay, so who do we say we are? Well, it's spelled out in 9 and 10, and oh my goodness, the entire chapter of the entire thing, chapter 1 of 1 Peter, also describes who we are. We have an inheritance. It's just so beautiful to read through that chapter and see that God caused us to be born again into this incredible inheritance, into hope. And so review that in your mind. If you are struggling, review that, because our identity then has an expectation that we are to live like who we say we are. Now, I want us to see that in a few other passages in the New Testament that just state that as a believer, as a newborn, born-again Christian, we have a new DNA. And so Peter is saying, in light of that new DNA, that potential, live it out. Live that potential. 2 Corinthians 5:17 tells us, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, born again, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come." So don't live in the old, live in the new. 1 Corinthians 5:6 and 7 says, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may have a new lump, as you really are unleavened. What in the world is this about dough and leaven, lumps of dough? This is a very Jewish picture that these people 2,000 years ago would understand. Leaven was symbolic of sin. And so what Paul is saying here to these Christians is get rid of the old leaven, get rid of sin in your life. This is something that they very actively participated in a very literal way in their homes to prepare for the Feast of the Unleavened Bread and Passover. They would actually take a lantern and look in all the nooks and crannies of their homes to make sure there wasn't a piece of old stale bread somewhere laying around that had leaven in it. And so they would clean out the leaven. So what he's telling us then, what we understand, is that we are to clean out any sin, any residual sin, because he says, you really are unleavened. In other words, your sins have been forgiven through Jesus Christ's death on the cross. So if they've been forgiven, get rid of them. Don't live in them anymore. And then finally, Matthew 7, Jesus is telling us in 17 through 20, so every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears fruit. But the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can the diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. What the point Jesus is making is not, strive to get better fruit. He's saying, if you are a Christian tree, if you are a born-again tree, you'll bear fruit. That's just, it's impossible for you not to bear fruit. And so, again, it's a statement that's saying, this is who you are. You're a child of God. You're his possession. You're born again. You have the DNA of Jesus Christ. So live it. Don't continue to live in your old way of living before Christ's way. So let's go ahead and say what he says that we are to do. In light of this new identity, what do we do? And the verse clearly says, this is verse 11 and 12 back in 1 Peter chapter 2. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. I love that he starts that plea, that sense of urgency with the title Beloved. Peter is speaking to people that he has great love for, that they are his brothers and sisters in Christ, so he calls them beloved. And in a way, you could also add, and to paraphrase, you could add, therefore, beloved, in light of who you are, therefore, my beloveds, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from passions of the flesh. And then in verse 12, to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. So those are the two commands, the two to-dos that Peter is calling on from us. Now, let's look at this. We'll look at those passions in a minute. But let's look at what he says about the passions. He said, abstain from these passions because they're waging war against your soul. They are waging war against my soul. What was my soul designed by God to do? What did he create my soul to do? Well, the answer is back in the middle of verse 9 of 1 Peter 2. Verse 9b says, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's our job. We are to proclaim the excellencies of God. He called us out of darkness into his marvelous life. He caused us to be born again. He gave us an inheritance. He loves us. He adores us. He will never, ever leave us. So we are to proclaim those excellencies to everyone that we come in contact with. And we talked about that to some extent last week, that we do this through our lifestyle and through our conversations. We live in relationship, not just with our fellow Christians, but we live in relationship with non-Christians, people who we're related to, family that we can't get away from, or people in the workplace, neighbors, and we need to know how to relate and to get along with people who are not believers. And so let's talk about these passions that Paul is warning us against. We'll talk about the war against our soul again in a minute. But let's look at the passions. So basically, if he has told us our goal or our job is to proclaim the excellencies of God, then the passions would be anything that shines brighter to me than the excellencies of this God who called me out of darkness into his marvelous light. What is that for you? What is that? What are those things that shine brighter than God? Things that shine brighter to you than Jesus? You know, there are all kinds of things it could be, but you have to answer that for yourself. What is that for you? There's a verse in the Psalm 73:25, that has always just kind of grabbed me, where the psalmist says, "Whom have I in heaven besides you? And on earth I desire no one but you." And I would add to that, "And on earth I desire no thing besides you." So what person, what thing, what stuff, what activity, what pleasurable, enjoyable thing shines more brightly to you than Jesus? That is a passion. That's the kind of passions that Peter is warning us against when he says, to abstain from those passions of the flesh. And the reason is they're warring against your soul. So let's talk about that for a minute. The enemy of your soul, the devil, does not want you to proclaim the excellencies of God and his son Jesus to the very people who need him most. Your unsafe family, your neighbors, your co-workers. And so those very people often speak evil against you because of your love for Jesus. So the devil is going to wage war against your soul. And he's going to do whatever it takes to get you to fall more in love with other things, other people, other activities than with Jesus. Peter calls these passions. And once this happens, our souls begin to lose their light of Jesus that's supposed to shine brightly. You know, we remember that Jesus said, "Don't cover your light with a basket. Put it up on a stand. Put it up on a hill so that people can see the light of Jesus and be warmed by the light of it." And often these habits, these shiny things that are shining more brightly to us than our love for the excellencies of God, those are the things that will eventually erode away the light that we have been given to shine in a dark world. And so he says, the devil's waging war against your soul, so you get busy fighting back. We need to wage war against the devil, okay? We've got to engage in a battle with an intensity that will overcome these things. Sometimes people call them besetting sins, those things in our lives that we don't talk about too much. We don't want to admit. that we still struggle with some of the same things that we've struggled with our entire walk with Christ. And these besetting sins are very, very ingrained. And to get rid of them requires a just supreme battle, a supreme effort to fight them. I want to look at some verses that talk about the kind of intensity that God would have us use to fight these things. Matthew 5:29 and 30 is a passage that has often been laughed at, misunderstood. I actually even saw a TV show one time where they used this verse in a very mocking way, where it was a medical show, like a hospital drama, and they had a patient come in who had cut off a private part of their body, a member of their body, because that part of their body was causing them to sin. And of course, the writers of the script had a field day with this verse. It's where Jesus said, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body goes into hell." Now, Jesus is not advocating for cutting or, really ruining your body and harming yourself in any way. This is a picture of the intensity that Jesus says it may require in order to fight some of our besetting sins. He's saying, be so concerned about your soul that you would even go so far as to harm your body, because the body is going to go away. Okay, these bodies, these tents, this body of flesh is very temporary, but our soul lives forever. And so he's saying, be very, very intentional. He says this actually also, the Lord says this in 1 Peter 1:13, which we looked at in the last chapter, that says, "Therefore prepare your minds for action." Or in some versions it says, "Gird up the loins of your mind." I love that picture of just like it says in Hebrews 12, to tie your shoes, really get rid of anything that would prevent you from running the race. So it's very intentional, very active kind of picture here of prepare your minds for action. Be sober-minded. Be serious about this. And set your hope fully on grace, the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So when it comes to any of these sins, be active, be intentional, and start with your mind. That's where we start. That's where we fight. We begin in our minds, and we allow our minds to then inform our emotions and our bodies. Also, a similar advice for fighting and warring in the Spirit is found in 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, where Paul says, "For though we walk in the flesh," in other words, we're still in these bodies, "we don't wage war according to the physical body. We wage war spiritually." It says in verse 4, "For the weapons of our warfare are not human fleshly weapons, but they are spiritual weapons that have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." I see that fifth verse, to destroy the arguments and every lofty opinion. There are going to be those out there, especially your non-Christian friends and maybe some Christian friends, they're going to say, "You know what, let's just excuse this away. You deserve this. You're a good person, so don't worry about these little things, these little besetting sins. Don't worry about it." And Paul is saying, no, we need to destroy those arguments and those opinions that will raise themselves against the knowledge of God. And so we are to take captive every one of those statements, those suggestions, the thoughts that come into our minds. We're to take those captive and make them obedient to the word of Christ. So these verses tell us to take on the offensive, to be very proactive in our warring against the enemy of our soul. So how do controlling those passions affect my conduct, as well as how my non-Christian friends react? Well, Peter tells us that controlling these passions will affect my living testimony. And he's saying that they will actually stop people, non-Christians, from speaking evil against us. Listen to these verses again. Verse 12 of 1 Peter 2 says, keep your conduct among the unsaved, or the Gentiles, honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Now, two things there. First of all, when he says, when they speak against you, I think he's saying they're going to speak against you. We should be aware of that reality. He's saying this is going to happen. You are going to be maligned. They are going to talk bad about you. They're going to slander you. And so he's saying one of our ways to combat that is to keep our conduct among them honorable. Another word there in the Greek, in the definition of the Greek word, kalim, is beautiful. And so we are to keep our conduct beautiful and honorable. And who is more beautiful than Jesus? We are being built into his image. And so let's make sure our conduct reflects that image, that it's a beautiful conduct. Because when they see our good deeds, there's a really good chance that they will glorify God. We'll get to that in a minute. I want you to see again in 1 Peter 2:15. We haven't gotten to that verse yet, but I want to read that to you. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So verse 12 told us that they call us evildoers, and this verse says that we can put them to silence because they're ignorant. And so what are some things that these people might say about Christians? I know that you've experienced it yourself, or you've heard it said. Well, they say things like, those Christians are just so judgmental. They're self-righteous. They're hypocritical. They use hate speech. They aren't loving, etc., etc., etc. And God forbid that any of that is true of us. I hope that that is not true of us. We need to make sure that we are walking around producing the fruit of the Spirit so that these things are not true of us. But what Peter is saying here is that people do say those things, whether they're true or not. But he's saying if we live good lives, if we live beautiful, honorable, Spirit-filled lives, producing the fruit of the Spirit, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, then what are they going to talk about? You can't argue against a beautiful life. And so that will shut it up. But let's make one point clear. We do not silence their criticisms of us by simply joining them in their passions of the flesh. I want to have you skip over to chapter 4, verses 3 and 4 of chapter 4. Let's see if I can find that really fast. This is where Peter says, "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do." In other words, you and I, he's referring to that period of time before we became followers of Jesus Christ. He said, in the past, You did what any other pagan would do. You lived in debauchery, in lust, in drunkenness, in orgies, in carousing, and detestable idolatry. But he says, that's over. And so the non-Christian now, verse 4, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But, verse 5, they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So, the truth is that we are, let me get back to my recording here, that we are going to be maligned if we don't join in. And so the solution is not just keep doing it. You know, I really struggle with this sometimes because I know that we live in the world, but we are to not be of the world. And so how we do that in a way that honors God is often challenging. And so I urge you to really give this some prayer time and think about your own situations socially, with family members, in the workplace. Give some serious thought to how to do this. How do we walk that line? And how do we live lives that honor Christ? Because the fact of the matter is, if we are doing it right, the people will notice, and they will be attracted to that. It will ultimately do what 1 Peter verse 12 says, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So the good deeds, let's talk about that for a second. You know, how do good deeds silence slanderous comments about us and ultimately lead people to glorify God? Well, first, we've already talked about, and I think the first one is to live holy lives without becoming holier than thou, allowing the fruit of the Spirit to pop out of us as we be a good friend. But I think the second thing is doing things within our communities that would silence the objectors, because we're doing things that benefit our communities. One of the things that is really kind of a hot button item right now, because we're in the 40 Days for Life among churches, and that is this issue of abortion. And as Christians, we are so strongly pro-life, and we must be very careful how we express that. And so, first of all, I would really recommend you go see the movie Unplanned, but also to get involved. And as we get involved, let's do it in a way that is very positive, very constructive. Let's get involved with those clinics for the woman who has no other support system. And so she has decided, okay, I am not going to kill this baby. I am going to have the baby and then give it up for adoption. Well, then find a clinic that does that and volunteer. That is a statement that people see. Oh, where are you going today? Well, I spend the afternoon on Tuesdays working in the Clear Choice Clinic. Well, what's that all about? And then we have this beautiful opportunity at that point to share in a loving and constructive way that we believe that killing or aborting a baby is not God's way. And we're wanting to support that woman who has no other resources. And so we're going to go and we're going to do spend whatever time we have to help out, to even beyond the birth of that child, help these adoptive parents or foster parents by in any way they need help, because it's a huge community of people that are involved in helping this one baby make it to life, and it requires something from all of us. And so I would urge you, instead of marching with a sign that says, you're murdering your baby, and the Grim Reaper is going to get you. And I mean, those things are offensive. They're offensive to me as a Christian, so they're offensive to the non-Christian. So instead, we get involved in ways that are prayerful, that are loving, that are kind, that give these women other choices. So that's one way. I think there are a lot of other things, and I love the fact that here in Big Fork, our women's Bible study has become known at Big Fork schools as those women that help us out. Those Christian women, the church ladies, as I think I've heard us called, that we help out when a child doesn't have a coat to wear in the cold winter, that we save those cash register receipts from Harvest Foods so that the schools can have the tools to teach their children adequately. And so become known in your community as a Christian who wants to serve. And it doesn't have to always be in a religious function. It can be completely secular, like the public school system. But there are so many ways. Work at the food bank. Serve in a soup kitchen. There's lots of things out there. But do you see that when we do that, we take away their arguments. We take away all of those slanderous things that they say about us, because we are being Jesus on the earth. We are doing the kinds of things Jesus would do if he was still here. And we know what those are because we saw him do it in the New Testament. And so look for ways to live a life that is a representation of Jesus in this world today. And we will see the people come around to glorify God on the day of visitation. The very last phrase of verse 12, on the day of visitation. That could mean the day that they are visited with salvation from Jesus Christ. It could also mean that when Christ returns, that they will be glorifying God. What an incredible opportunity that we have. Thank you for listening.